speaking of sort of a litmus test for authenticity, let me throw this out to you. So let's say, as a teacher, I present a scenario. I draft a letter from the mayor of Louisville, Kentucky, and in it this letter asks those students to solve a specific problem, and it's a great problem. The students are engaged. They really feel like they're doing some worthwhile, meaningful work. But the letter is actually a simulation. It's a role-playing situation. So, is that really authentic, or does it need to? Does it in your minds? Does it really have to be something that is doing real work for real clients? And when can simulations and role-playing work?
So in my book, I list all these differences between simulations and authentic learning experiences. And I think that there's certainly a time and a place for simulations in the classroom as we scaffold through the authentic learning experience. But at the end of the day with that simulation, it typically boils down to, in many cases, just an activity. And oftentimes, it's not allowing students to see how they can truly affect change. And I have been a part of some very successful simulations. You know, my government class, we're located just outside of Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, so my government class was able to participate in a simulation in which they, along with many other schools in the area, came together at the Capitol, and we had a model legislation session where they were on the House floor and they were debating current legislation that is before the Pennsylvania House. But at the end, that's still a simulation, and they're not affecting change. So then what I did as an extension of that, I allowed my students then to choose an issue that they felt was something that needed to be changed in Pennsylvania, and then craft their own legislation from that, determining where the funding would come from, the committee that it would need to be referred to, and going through that whole process when they then proposed that legislation to our local legislators. So using that simulated let's pretend activity, even though we were role-playing exactly what the legislators were doing, moving beyond that to where the students say, hey, we have this possibility, this real possibility to truly affect change.
Okay. Anybody have any other thoughts on that?
I think Dana handled it pretty nicely and sort of anticipated maybe some of my criticisms, but I think the point to stress is that we can think of authentic both in a global sense of all the things that are real about the project that the students are working on, or we can also think about it a little bit more discreetly in terms of the elements of a project where there is some authentic learning going on. And I think Dana highlighted that really nicely. It's true that the simulations that she described, which are very similar to my long background working with the United Nations Association on the Model UN program, it's true that those may not necessarily lead to change. No group of kids debating in Model UN this weekend is going to prevent a U.S. attack on Syria. However, their communication skills being used in that simulation, trying to persuade at least 200 of their peers, are very authentic communication skills. Either they can persuade their peers and get the votes, or they can't, right? It's not a question of a teacher using a rubric to say, yes, your speech was good or not, which feels more like an assignment or an activity. But at the end of the day, they get 87 out of 200 votes, and they know that they needed to do a better job making their case. The same thing with a mock trial, or with certain science activities, and maybe Ted has a way to comment on how a science project that doesn't necessarily go out and change the world could still be authentic in the classroom.
I think Dana said it, like, not every single thing that we have been able to do in our classroom maybe has an authentic value to what we're talking about. So then we got to be really careful to talk about that with our students so they know up front, because if we're going to try to teach empathy and deep understanding for other people, then we need to make sure we're real and we're not fake. We want to be very, very honest up front with that. And I agree with you at the same time on some other things, that there are some issues in science that it's going to be difficult for kids to actually come up with solutions that are going to change the world. But as long as the interactions are authentic and they're authentic with a variety of different people and their solutions are as real as we can get them to be, then we're on that right path.
Yeah, and I would agree with Ted. I think it's virtually impossible to say that everything that my student does, that Ted's, that Tim's complete, will affect change. There are situations where I've had students that have pitched letters to Dateline NBC to say, we need to do a big expose on this. And I know that there is a very slim chance that Dateline NBC is going to respond to that and do anything with it. But to listen to the student and say, Mrs. Lauer, can you imagine if they really produce this show and we will have done something about that? It's the idea that potentially that could happen out of the authentic learning experience. I don't think that you can always create the sense like where Ted has the wonderful opportunity with his I Challenge You program in the summer, where we are already linking them with businesses, and the businesses are coming to them and saying, here's the problem, help us solve this. So you can still have that very authentic piece and that very meaningful piece, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is something that will fully be enacted as a result of what you're doing in the classroom with your students.
Yeah, Drew, if I could add one more thing that hasn't been mentioned, but I think it's important that I think one of the test cases for whether you're really going to let authentic learning have an effect on your school is the extent to which you are willing to allow your students to tackle authentic issues within the school community itself. And I think this has been a breakpoint issue in some of the schools that I have worked with that have experimented with authentic learning, is when the students decide to turn their empowerment focus onto an issue in the school community, school leadership either recognizes it as a valid concern or tends to sort of squash it and say no, and that has dire consequences for authentic learning across the campus. You've talked about ACE Leadership School. That's a school where when the students realize there's an issue with the school, that can become a project that the students can work on, and the school leadership embraces that. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. You can't just say authentic learning is good for outside of the community and never let the focus turn to something that's happening inside your school building.
Absolutely agreed.
Thank you, Ted.
We've got a comment. We've got several folks here that are viewing, and we do have a comment here that relates to our comments or our discussion here. Yeah. So Thomas Sauer says, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, authentic learning can't start with imagine. Any thoughts on that? Or is it? I've
come across a project that started that way.
No. Is it about the audience? Because Tim, your point, your example about the UN and being able to persuade that group and then having that real-time feedback of did they do it or not, strikes me almost as an issue of whether the audience is making it authentic. And
it could be a function of the audience, but I guess I would push back a little bit again and say that it really depends on sort of accepting that some projects may have authentic elements without themselves being entirely authentic, right? And especially just starting out with this, charging out into the community, grabbing business people and saying, we want to help you solve your business issues, may be a massive undertaking for a new school. But starting out with kids who are, and I'll take an example from a local community issue here, where we've got a 800,000 square foot old Hewlett-Packard building that's sitting empty, right? And the community has tried to do stuff with it over and over and over again, and most of them have gone bust. Saying to those students, imagine what you might do with that empty space, and then sharing that with the larger community could still be a very effective project, because it's almost certain that at least a couple of those ideas will get scooped up. And so I'm not sure that the word imagine is an automatic deal breaker for me.